and welcome to Conversations with Agents of Change. I'm Izchel Boyd, and today's Conversations is one I've been really looking forward to. My guest is Dr. John Kelly, trained in medicine, but rather than staying with a traditional clinical path, he followed a deeper question, one that sits at the heart of this podcast. What happens when systems don't reflect how humans actually work? Through his work with Fingerprint Learning, John has spent years challenging deficit-based models of education and development, advocating for upstream thinking, brain diversity, and systems that work with people rather than against them. John, it's really good to have you here.
Thank you.
John, one of the reasons we consider you an agent of change is that you didn't just work within existing systems. You stepped back and questioned their foundations. Was there a moment or a realization when you understood that improving outcomes wasn't enough and that the system itself needed change?
Izzy, first of all, it's great to speak to you. I've been looking forward to it. I think it was a process which was a reflection of some of my personality. Now that I understand my personality better, I wish that when I was a teenager I knew what I know now about my personality. And I was saying to you earlier, I'm a big fan of the 5 factors, the big five, because that has helped me enormously. But one of the big 5 factors is high openness, and I would be high in openness, which is exploring ideas, thinking outside the box. And I've always been interested, even since I was a teenager, in thinking about things and what I've come to call now upstream thinking. So, for instance, in my current work, a lot of what I do when I'm talking to people is that, yes, you're involved in what I call downstream interventions. You're applying interventions in education or in social work or community work. But if we go upstream in our thinking, maybe it would change the interventions we're making. And when was the last time upstream thinking was applied to those interventions? So I think that's a bit of a natural bent for me. And as I then went through medicine, got involved in education, actually helped to found an independent school for a while, which was definitely stepping outside the mainstream. But we got the opportunity when we did that to try new approaches to education that were based on the individuality of the learner. And I mean, that's a good example of what we're talking about here. For instance, when you look at education as not primarily imparting information and a teaching process, but you say, no, it's a learning process. And then you ask, are the children actually learning as opposed to are they being taught? That turns everything on its head, because then you're saying now, well, if the child isn't learning, then something's wrong with the teaching.
Yes.
So then you go upstream and you think, well, are there ways of applying, of imparting information that are different to the ways we've always been doing it? So I think education probably was the main way I began to think upstream more in one specific area. My first wife and I, she died quite suddenly, not long after we did this, but we homeschooled our daughter. The reason we did that was because where her birthday fell, she'd have had to do playgroup for 2 years,
Okay.
which we were just repeating a year.
Yeah.
So we began to homeschool and explore that. And that got me into understanding the children learn in different ways. And in the 1990s, when this was taking place, there was an explosion of understanding about the brain, largely through the development of scanners, and pharmaceutical companies were pouring so much money into research on the brain, concerned about strokes and Alzheimer's. So the money was coming from pharmaceutical companies that had it, but the research results revealed so much about the brain and about the brain as the organ of learning
Yes.
and the differences in the way that people learn. So that really got my attention, and I've been going upstream ever since then.
That sounds really exciting. And
Yeah.
that insight that you just gave us, it really resonated with me because it's not about criticism, but it's more about like curiosity. How does that
Yes.
work and how can we improve that? So I know you train in medicine, which often focuses on diagnosis and interventions when something is already wrong.
Yes.
But how did that background shape the way you think about learning the brain and the upstream thinking about prevention, design, and strengths rather than deficits?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I love it because when I'm working with teachers or educators, fingerprint learning, which is what I developed, the business I developed, has to do with the concept of obviously the fingerprint. There's a uniqueness, like nobody else has your fingerprints. And even identical twins don't have the same fingerprints. That's unique. And a man who won the Nobel Prize for his research into the brain said the uniqueness and individuality of the wiring of our brains is more specialized than our fingerprints.
Wow.
That really took my breath away when I saw that. So when you realize, and I have a very strong feeling that people have untold value because of their individuality, because I do believe everyone has been created in God's image, and that's, you cannot be more valuable than that. So the worst thing you can do is to devalue somebody. Now, you can devalue somebody by not appreciating their individuality or by judging their individuality by your own standards, for instance. And so in fingerprint learning, we have this approach that is a lot of education I see as being deficit based. You can't do this, and we're going to help you make up that deficit. For instance, you don't know this, we're going to make up that deficit, as opposed to an asset-based one, which is, what do you have? What can you do? Well, let's work with what can you do, and then that's how we will manage the deficit, if you want. And so a lot of young people, for instance, this is true educationally with statistics in our society, we trumpet the very high results we get at A levels and GCSEs, but we have huge numbers of young people that are really falling through the trapdoor at the bottom. It's a massive problem. Economic activity is a massive problem, and we don't talk so much about that. Now, those are the kids that have been dealt with as if they have a deficit,
Yes.
and then eventually that they just go through the trapdoor. So one of our approaches is, for instance, we have this thing called the 8 smartnesses. So we say to children, it's not how smart are you? Now, if you're in primary school, you measure that usually by literacy and numeracy.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you're not doing well in spelling or number, you know that pretty quickly. Or in secondary level, it's maybe like English, math, science. Okay. But it's usually related to exams. So say it's not how smart you are, it's how are you smart? And we have 8 ways of identifying smartness. So we use this with children as young as maybe 3, 4 years old, for instance, and especially when it comes to 7, which I'll explain in a minute. But we help them realize, okay, what are the ways that you are smart? Well, here's a good example. A word smart child can be a child who's not necessarily smart just through reading and writing, but they're not lost for words. So we say, do you get in trouble for speaking too much in class? Okay,
Totally, yeah.
here's a word smart child. So we take negatives sometime. Do you have trouble sitting still? And are getting told off for always getting out of your step. Maybe that's a body smart child, or nature smart, or self smart. So when the children look at the range of smartnesses, not in a hierarchy, and see that they are smart in 4, 5, 6 ways, okay, what does that do with the child?
Yeah.
You with me? So while the literacy and numeracy is still important, yet they see that they're smart in other ways. Now, I could go into all the neuroscience behind that is massively supportive. But I'll give you a simple example. I trained in one school in North Belfast, all the staff, and the principal in the school, what he got his staff to do was every week they would reward the children for the Self Smart Prize, the Body Smart Prize. So there were 8 things to go for, as well as literacy and numeracy. So then every couple of weeks, he would get teachers in the upper primary and lower primary to nominate one child for that self-smart or whatever the 8 smartnesses were. And when you went into the school, the first thing you saw on the notice board was the photograph of the children and the smartness. Now, what was brilliant about it, in the course of the year, number one, all the children had a chance to aspire
Yes.
towards
Yeah.
that and not just literacy and numeracy. And the other thing was that they would get rewarded not because they were the best at self-smartness, but they were trying harder.
Yeah.
If they worked at it, they would get the reward for that. Now, when you understand again the whole role of dopamine and neurotransmitters, and which I won't go into now, you can explain why that's working. But the brilliant thing about those children was they were growing up thinking, I am smart. And I have met young people, I've worked with what you call NEETs, not in education or training, they're at the bottom of the pile. They haven't succeeded at anything. And when they've done a program with us, and I've said, would you come, if someone has said, would you come to a program with Dr. Kelly on neuroscience and learning what you have said, they wouldn't have come. I said, you've just done it. After 5 sessions, you've just done that. Don't let anybody tell you what you can't do. But they always say, if I'd been told this in primary school,
Yes.
I wouldn't be here today.
And that just
So,
kind of forms your vision of self.
it's your shape of self, of course, and of course, it's an asset-based approach. What do you have? Not the deficit approach. So when we get to P7 with these children, what we say is, right, what kind of jobs would a self-smart person do? What kind of jobs would a bot? And immediately the children come out with immediately ideas and jobs. So they begin at 10 or 11 years old to think, I could be. So you're raising aspiration of what they could be. Now, what I found in education is so much attention is given to this whole question of what they call educational underachievement. And I have a real problem with this because anything I've been to about it usually starts with statistics that say, well, educational underachievement is failing to get something like grade C's at GCSE. And I think this is what I mean by upstream thinking. I said, who decided that that's underachievement? Who decides that? I did research into entrepreneurs in Northern Ireland, the majority of whom would not have got the GCSEs. It would have been O levels in their day. They wouldn't have got it, but they became very successful. So who's decided that underachievement is that academic standard there? And it makes these children think, I am an underachiever. But if you go with their smartness, what you find is that suddenly aspiration goes up. So part of my concern is education is we think we're going to pour a lot of money into getting achievement up. But if you raise aspiration, you'll get better achievement. So I see it like having a boat on a sandbank. You can push and push at low tide, it won't work.
Okay.
Raise the tide, it's easier. So if you raise the tide of aspiration, it's easier to get achievement. So we have what we call our 4A program. The top A is access to training or work or something like that. That's built on achievement. Yes, you got to get the qualifications. That's the way it works. But achievement's based on raising aspiration, and not enough goes in to young people raising their aspiration. I could come back to that in a second. But underneath that, you've got attitude. So if their attitude to themselves is either I can't or I won't, you've got to change that attitude first, then raise the aspiration, and then you get the achievement. So that's the whole approach we use. For instance, to the smartnesses, which is just one example of that.
Yeah.
When you get children saying, I'm body smart, I could become something, well, then they're on the way. They're a moving vehicle. Then, as opposed to thinking, well, no, you're not doing well enough at this, and we're going to help you. And I think this has huge, huge implications for special educational needs. I think we're really in a very, very difficult situation over that now that's getting worse and worse. And I'm convinced if you could begin to impart this concept of smartnesses to all children, even those with special needs are smart in their ways, and if that's being imparted to them, you're raising in their brain, you're changing the whole neurochemical environment that could actually lift them out of special educational need into a different category.
Absolutely. And I think that also reduces that stress and anxiety that children have in everyday lives, because they have this self-talk that turn into self-talk because that's what they keep hearing since they were very young.
Exactly.
You're not good at this, you're bad at that. So instead, if we remove that, we focus on what they are actually good at,
Exactly.
and we help them to thrive following what they have in their own
And
particular
this
skills.
applies to another area I've worked on too, which is the right and left hemisphere as well too, because we have two hemispheres that are divided between the two. This was very vivid to me when I was training as a doctor, because we had one of our lecturers showed us a slide of when he'd been in Africa working in a hospital in the bush, and a man walked into the casualty with a nail hammered into his head that went right between the two hemispheres. And the man, they just took the nail out and gave him antibiotics because it hadn't damaged his brain, because there's a gap between the two sides, although they're joined at the bottom, so that there's an interconnection. Dr. Ian McGilchrist has done tremendous work on this, but the way the left hemisphere operates is very different to the right. And just very, very briefly, our whole education system is geared towards left hemisphere process data-driven thinking, and the right hemisphere is more unorthodox, more random, and more intuitive. And we have a real problem in our society in general is that we overvalue information as data and we undervalue information as intuition. And they are both equally valuable. So a child in school who's more what you call left hemisphere dominant and fits the system will probably thrive in education, whereas a child that is more right dominant, and this can become very apparent even from 2, 3 years of age, child that challenges more, thinks outside the box more, explores more, tries to fit people around them rather than fit in with what's expected. Those children are looked as problem children and may even be statemented for behavior problems when they are right dominant learners. Now, what I'm getting to is simply this. In our education system, in our teacher training colleges, even here in Northern Ireland, teachers are not taught about the right and left hemisphere differences. And yet they're facing them every single day. And here's a good example. If they don't know what they are, and you have a very left dominant teacher who's very much by the book, trying to teach a right dominant child who's the opposite, you can have behavioral clashes every single day.
Yes.
And so then that child begins to be looked on as a problem. Parent-teacher interview, what happens is the parents are told this child is always challenging, they're random thinkers, they're not doing what exactly the parents go home and say, well, you need to change. That child could be a potential entrepreneur. This is a massive issue in our education system in certainly the West and certainly in this province and in this island, because I meet people who, when they went to school, wrote with their left hand and were disciplined
Yes.
to force to write with the right hand. Now, we would consider that child abuse now to do that, okay? Now, we have the same thing happening in terms of children that are more right dominant learners who are being forced to learn in left dominant ways and penalized if they don't do that. The same thing's happening. And probably in 20 years' time, we'll look back and say that was abuse, but it is happening every single day in our schools.
And I think general society rejects a child that is very inquisitive. Like, don't ask questions, just do what you're told.
Just exactly. Here's the data. You repeat the data in the exam. Don't question it. Don't just do what you're supposed to do and you'll get the qualification. And so we then have the young people who are only interested in just get the qualification. And in my research, I found this as well too, that at 16 years old, so many students who go into further education college, all they want is to get the qualification. They want to be, as the lecturer said to me, spoon-fed. They don't want to be encouraged to think or to create or be enterprising. In fact, they've got to be educated to be enterprising. After 15 years in the education system, you've got to train them to be enterprising.
And that's certainly changing the way we perceive society and how we are slowing down, because when you teach people to just repeat what they're told or to follow a certain path of thinking instead of being critical and make their own judgment and trying to be inquisitive themselves and to have their own curiosity, that is not necessarily helping humanity or us to
Well, no, I agree. And
change.
I think the impact on society is huge because when you start in early years, children are encouraged to be inquisitive. That's how they learn, by being inquisitive. If you found a child who wasn't inquisitive, you would worry about them. But once we get them into primary 2, 3, 4, the whole thing becomes much more programmed. Ken Robinson, a great education thinker, says schools kill creativity. A friend who told me of his wife who was a primary school teacher, and she worked with primary 2, 3 for many years. And if it was raining outside in the playground, she gave the children a blank sheet of paper and said, just draw an itch, and drew and whatever it is. She had to take a P7 class one day, and she did the same thing when it was raining. And the children said, what do you want us to draw, miss? That showed you how over those years, the children had lost that ability to just be creative. And so the skills of reasoning, the skills of thinking, the skills of questioning, and of course, with the development of AI, when you build it on top of that kind of a system, are becoming worse because you avoid having to think altogether when AI can do the thinking for you. Okay. So AI is great if we weren't building on a faulty foundation.
Exactly.
But we're building on a faulty foundation, and therefore I think it's more liable to be abused.
I agree.
I think we have huge areas in education that they're not even being discussed. That's the biggest problem I have, Izzy. They're not even being discussed.
And we don't just leave that behind at school, do we? We carry into work. We carry like the confidence, even how we see ourselves and
Yes.
in our offices and in our
Yes.
companies. So that is a problem that it doesn't stay there. It
Yeah.
follows us.
Yes.
When you think about critical thinking, when we make decisions, when we hear news, if you haven't practiced those skills to be critical of
Yes.
yourself, it's just very difficult to continue life in a society in which you are not thinking
Yeah.
yourself. Your research has shown us that many entrepreneurs and innovators struggle in a traditional education system.
Yeah.
Why was it important for you to make that visible talent visible?
I had developed a friendship with a senior lecturer in Stimulus College, and we were talking about education and entrepreneurs, and many anecdotal stories about how entrepreneurs didn't do well at school but were successful later on. So they obviously weren't stupid.
Yeah.
But there was very little research done into it. The traits of entrepreneurs had been very well researched, but what we call the learning preferences, the way they learn, had not been researched. In fact, when we did a search on it, no one in the world had researched this in 29. So the research we did in Belfast was the first into their learning preferences. And we chose some different metrics. One was this right and left hemisphere characteristics. One was conformity and nonconformity, and one was a thing called mind styles. And what we came out with, we researched 55 entrepreneurs in Northern Ireland, some very well-known ones, some young ones, female, some social, some commercial. We did it across the spectrum, and we used those metrics for them. We did their school background, their business background, and what we found, we didn't know if there'd be a common pattern. And to our delight and surprise, a very similar pattern came out with between about 80 to 90% of them. They were non-conforming. They were what we call concrete random. Concrete means you learn by doing, not abstractly sitting in a classroom, but by doing. And they were random thinkers, and they didn't link information up sequentially as it's done in school. They tended to get things out of the air and make connections out of the blue. They were random thinkers, and they were right hemisphere dominant. In other words, they questioned why you do things. They were big picture thinkers. They went with a gut feeling on things. So we found 80 to 90% were in that category there. And what we then saw was that our education system favors conformity, it favors left hemisphere dominance, and it favors abstract sequential thinking, complete opposite. So our education system was totally opposite to what entrepreneurs were. So when we presented the research, what we were saying is government rhetoric is saying, it was talking about we've got too big a public sector. We have to shrink that. We need a bigger private sector to make the money to pay for the public services. Who creates the private sector? Entrepreneurs. Where are the future entrepreneurs in school? Who are they? They're the non-conforming, random, left-brained, concrete random thinkers. What are we making them do? We are making them conform, teaching them in left hemisphere ways diametrically opposite to what we're saying we need. And so what became apparent to us was that we have an education system that's serving itself. If you're with me, it just keeps get the qualifications, but it's not work. Now you can identify those characteristics at 3, 4, P3, 4, 5, 6 in school. But if that's being, as they move upwards towards, say, transfer age, and I'm not commenting on the transfer test, right, as they move up to that age, that is so suppressed in them that they have to fight their way through the system to, if they're actually going to become entrepreneurial in the end of the day. So that was really what got me focused on this right left hemisphere thing. And I've talked to so many entrepreneurs since then. I mean, everything we did in the research has been further and further and further reinforced in the last 12 years.
I think that feels like advocacy more than research. And it really reframes failure and how we believe that we are broken students.
Yes.
And it helps us understand that, well, I have other talents that I could potentially use. So I found that it's very interesting. And it sounds like the system wasn't built for how some people's brains work. So I think it's very important what you work about researching that and trying to voice this out. So hopefully we can reframe education in a way that we can favor those people who think differently.
Well, you see, it's one of the things that's so difficult because in my experience, what you find is the people who are the decision makers in education have come through a left brain system and it worked for them. They're now in charge of it.
Yes.
So they have no idea how much it disfavors the right brain students, the entrepreneurial students. The education inspectorate inspects schools by what I call left hemisphere metrics. Teachers who want to go into education have to get in, you've got to be successful in the left brain skills. Even if you're right dominant, you then get 4 years of a left dominant education in teacher training college or PGCE. Then you go into a left dominant system. So all of our education is biased towards that. All institutions are biased to the left hemisphere because it's easier to manage, it's easier to administrate, and they work against the right hemisphere. So what you find is that more right hemisphere students don't want to go into education. So we get less teachers who are right dominant. So it's getting to the stage now where a right dominant child going through primary school, if they meet a right dominant teacher for a year who gets them and teaches them with what I call the grain of their brain, they died and gone to heaven for that. They love that. But they can change the next year, a whole year with a teacher who's left dominant, and that child can struggle for that year, for a whole year. Now, what bothers me is teachers are not taught about the right and left hemisphere differences. They don't know about them. They are not taught in teacher training college. This is so fundamental. They don't know whether they are left or right dominant because they bring into the classroom in their teaching who they are.
Of
But if
course.
they're not even told about this, how can they possibly recognize what's going on in a child? I'll give you a simple example. In the training I do, a left dominant child will love questions that have got a clear right or wrong answer, what I call closed questions. They love it because the left hemisphere likes certainty. So if they know the answer is right or wrong, they like that. But open-ended questions, what do you think about, where there's no clear right or wrong, they don't like that. But right hemisphere students love that kind of thing because they're exploring. So if a teacher in preparing for their classes then thinks, right now, I'm going to use questions to find out how they've learnt, and they only, because they're left dominant, only use closed questions that are right or wrong, they're missing out all the right hemisphere students.
Absolutely.
Or if they're right dominant, and they make it too exploratory, the left dominant students are sitting there thinking they're scared. They don't want to answer because they're looking for what's the right or wrong answer. Now, this is just daily experience in a classroom that's going on. But if you don't train your educators to understand this, it's never going to get into the classroom. This is my greatest frustration, I suppose, is that the things that I'm talking to you about, I think, how long will it take for these ever to get into the classroom for our children, to influence them and to help them? I don't see any sign of it in our province.
Yeah. I was just about to ask that. How can we just change those systems to adapt them? So it seems to be that there's a lot of work. But I love the fact that we're having this conversation. So most people are understanding those differences. And I would have thought, I mean, as I mentioned before, I'm very interested in neuroscience. So I read this book when I was probably 14, that it was about how the different brains work. I mean, it's called male brain, female brain.
Yes.
And to me, that was something very eye-opening because I thought, well, everybody has a brain and it's the same brain.
Yes.
Well, yes, in general terms it is,
Yes.
but there are ever so slightly differences that make everything so different.
So you see, we use this phrase, and I alluded to it there, but if you liken the brain to a piece of wood and you plane a piece of wood with the grain, you always get a good result. But no matter how good your plane is, if you plane against the grain, you don't get a good result. Now, if you liken the way an individual's brain is wired to a piece of wood, and I'm the teacher, and I teach one child with the way they learn, the grain of the brain, they learn, they feel good about learning, they want to go on learning. But if I teach another child the same way and it's against the grain of their brain, no matter how much a good teacher I think I am, they do not learn, but they think they're the problem. They think they're stupid. Now, every teacher brings into the classroom the grain of their own brain, for instance, and then can tend to assume that's how the children should learn. So knowing, and this is what fingerprint learning does, it teaches teachers to understand what is the grain of your brain, how can you identify the grain of your students' brains, and then how can you teach them with the grain of the brain. Well, people say you can't do that for 20 or 25 children. Well, no, you can do it. This is what we train people to do.
Yes.
And if you take, for instance, classroom assistants, especially who are so important, it can be so undervalued in the classroom, their roles, because they're working one-to-one with the
Yes.
child. And the issue is for them, how can I help that child learn? Well, for that classroom assistant to know the grain of that child's brain in some detail, so they know how to intervene and work with the grain of that child's brain, can make all the difference to that child's life. So classroom assistants should be having these tools in their toolkit, I believe.
Absolutely. And I agree completely, because at the end of the day, what we are doing as grown-ups in general, like, it doesn't matter what role you play in children's lives, you are a facilitator. You are helping them to achieve their best self.
Yes.
So if we don't know which tools are best for them,
For that
you
child.
cannot facilitate anything.
Yes.
So the fact that we're having this conversation and helping people understand these differences, and hopefully inspiring people and policymakers and decision makers to change that, hopefully we'll get that in the right direction.
I'll put a plug in here for my book, because I wrote a book in 2016 called Whole Brain Learning for parents and for teachers and learners, because most of the material was not accessible for parents. So I did this for parents. It's called Whole Brain Learning and Teaching. Now, that was 2016, and it's still very relevant today. But where the neuroscience has gone to, if I was rewriting that book, or maybe another volume, there is so much to be added to that in what's being discovered about learning and the neuroscience. I would stand over everything I've written, but I would have a lot more to say about it, especially in terms of neurotransmitters.
I would be absolutely excited to read about that. You've consistently focused on upstream thinking, addressing root causes rather than downstream fixes. What does upstream change look like in practice when designing education or on organizations?
Well, I'll give you a good example of that, because I've been involved in the last couple of years with a number of organizations working with economic inactivity, which everyone believes is the biggest drag on our economy, economically inactive adults. So one of these, there was 5 organizations in Belfast called Belfast Works Connect, which is an excellent organization. They do excellent work. And they were given money to work with economically inactive people. These are people who don't want work and are not in work.
Okay.
So you can't come and say, I'll help you get a job if you come and see me, because they don't want to know about that. So you've got to find a different way of approaching that. So I won't go into that too much, but that gave me an understanding of the large number of economically inactive adults we have, and the money that has to be spent downstream when they're 16 plus to try to get them into work. Now, the more I looked at that and applying the neuroscience, that the more I could see that actually the problem began in P2 and 3 in school. That's upstream thinking. Because these children got turned off learning and education in P2, 3, and 4 in school, because they thought they were not learners. This is the deficit problem, okay? And so because that never got changed, we end up then at 16 with all of these young people who are not economically enough because they haven't got qualifications, but also they have no incentive to learn. They have no incentive to work. You can't mention work to them. They don't want to work. So why do you not spend the money in P3 and 4 helping these children, like I was saying about the 4As, change their attitudes, raise their aspiration, help them to achieve, so that learning becomes something that gives them a real hit in their brain, as opposed to school becoming like prison for them every day.
Without hearing that they are broken learners.
100%. So that to me is a very good example of upstream thinking. Now, one of the difficulties that we have in this province is that though schools are education, and then economic activity is the Department of the Economy. And these two do not collaborate.
Yeah.
So people say, oh, well, that's Department of Education problem, that's Department of the Economy problem. But hold on a second here. So if we had upstream thinking in our civil service, we would say, hold on, and would it not make sense to link these two things together? And instead of spending all this money on economically inactive adults, do something about it. You know, for instance, a lot of economically inactive adults could be very, and don't think research has been done on it, could be strong right brain learners,
Yeah.
for instance, who were turned off
Absolutely.
at an early age and or are not very non-conforming, So to me, that's a good example of the need for upstream thinking. And when I was talking to people in the civil service, this came out as well too, because what I've gathered there, very, very, very good people doing a great job, but saying we are so busy applying the interventions that are being constantly put to us, we have no time to think upstream.
Yes.
And if you're going to think upstream, you've got to have time. The second thing is this as well, that a lot of people like to talk about innovation, but process people will never be innovative. It's the right dominant people who are the innovators. They just think innovatively. And one of the things I work on is this whole concept of a balanced team. On a balanced team, you need the right hemisphere innovators. You need the process people who are implementers who turn it into something practical on the ground. And in the middle, you've got the people who can move between the right and left hemisphere, what I call the enterprising people, who are like the glue between the two. Now, a balanced team has all three, but if you have a team that's primarily all process people, and I mean, this is probably the civil service, and this is not just an opinion, this has been said to me within and outside the civil service, it's primarily process orientated, it's left hemisphere dominant. So if you want innovation and you don't have innovative thinkers, there's no point talking to people who are largely process people and trying to think, can you please be more innovative?
Of course.
It's not who they are. You need more of the innovative people in. But if you don't recruit the innovative people in, if you've got barriers to them wanting to be in civil service, you'll not get innovation.
That's pretty much what's happening in every company nowadays. They are favored people who are following the rules. They are favored over people who challenge that. And I think that's why it's so relevant for a conversation with the agent of change, because we believe that we must
Yeah,
somehow
no,
challenge the
absolutely.
status quo.
Yeah, and also the other problem is that when they get into trouble, then they think, oh, we need new ideas. That's when they need.
Yes, and
Yeah.
sometimes could be too little too late.
Yeah, exactly. It can be too late. Or they come up with the new ideas, and then what happens is it gets turned into a process, and then the whole thing becomes left hemisphere dominated again.
I would like to hear your opinion on, like, if your work were fully embedded
Yes.
into how we educate and develop people, how do you imagine that might be different in 20 years?
You would start with teacher education. You would make teacher education college or PGCE more attractive to right dominant learners as well. And you would include uh, more self-awareness in the students who are being trained. And you would invest a lot more in teacher education development. Then not only introduced what we now know about neuroscience and psychology, but was in tune with where it's going to, if that makes sense, because if you only bring people up to speed with what's there now, in 1 year's time, it'll be even further on. So you need people in our colleges and education. They don't have to be experts in the area, but they're keeping their finger on the pulse of what's happening. It's a bit like AI. We're not going to get a choice with AI. Education is going to have to change because AI is driving that, and the children are going to be way ahead of where the teachers are. So something will have to happen there. So it's on the agenda. But the issues that we're talking about here today are not on the agenda because it's not been driven by real life experience. So just like we need to have people who don't have to be AI specialists but are aware of what's happening in AI and education, we need people who are aware of what's happening in neuroscience and psychology in education as well. And I don't mean by psychologists, educational psychologists, I mean more generalized psychology as well.
That's a very interesting overview. So I think that all that needs to be very interdisciplinary, and sometimes it gets very focused on, oh, we only need,
Yes.
like, the curriculum could be necessarily focusing on certain topics, where I think it should be more holistic, involve more practical learning from, like, an outdoor school, like forest schools, trying to use the environment to learn, use technology in other areas, not just the way it's been seen traditionally. Languages to me is particularly important. I think it's very important for the development of the brain, how we use our different skills in order to be able to learn.
Well, two things about languages. One is that language has been taught very much in the past in a very left hemisphere way. And like right hemisphere learners learn by listening, being involved, and being engaged in real life experience of language. And certainly it may be more now, but it wasn't taught like that whenever I was younger, for instance. But the other thing is we know is this, and I've done a lot of work on mental well-being and preventing dementia. I've been working on programs for preventing dementia since 2010 called the Brain Fit Plan. And what we know for sure is that people who are bilingual are less liable to get Alzheimer's
Oh, very good.
than people who don't. So learning another language from an early age, actually, this is upstream thinking. It's actually a way of preventing people getting dementia later on in their 60s or 70s. In fact, we all know now actually Alzheimer's starts 20 years before you get dementia. So actually the disease starts, if you got dementia in your 70s, the disease started in your 40s and 50s. Okay. So if you have learnt another language, even at that stage, you are going to put off the likelihood of getting Alzheimer's. So if we were doing this in schools for our children, we've got a public health benefit.
Exactly, yeah.
But I don't find anyone talking about that, because here's education and here's health. They're two different departments.
And they should be interconnected, because all is that about the holistic self, the being of the person.
Yeah.
And it's not just like what you need to work on or you have to study. It's your whole.
It's your whole life. Yes, absolutely. And this is why, as I was saying to you in our earlier conversation about the soul, I'm so convinced that we have lost not the concept, we've lost the soul of an individual in education, because that holistic view, languages, music, culture, history, the classics, literature, that nourishes the soul of the child. Now, our education system doesn't even talk about the soul. It informs the brain, but doesn't nourish the soul. And so we are having children who are coming through our education system whose souls, I just say, are like empty shells because they have not been nourished. Now, that has all kinds of implications in terms of relationships, marriage, family. The richness of your life experience is related to the richness of how that soul was developed. And I see this as one of the biggest crises in our education system now, because we measure so much by qualifications and information and not the development of a person
Absolutely.
and people.
And that is very sad as well, because that is leading to a lot of children and adolescent depression and anxiety and
Mental illness.
sense of loss. And
It's, again, this is upstream thinking, because I'm convinced that a lot of the huge rise in mental health issues for teenagers is the result of what has happened to them in primary school. If we went upstream and dealt with it there, if we were enriching their lives, if we were developing their right hemisphere more, for instance, things like that, we would have much less of the mental health issues that we have.
absolutely, the fact that we are not necessarily encouraging as much as curiosity or gratitude or just looking to the bright side and enjoying. I mean, I think we should, even in this country that is raining very often, I think we should spend more time outside.
Yeah, 100%. Also, that AI is then now feeding into this as well, because you don't need to have relationships with people now. You can have a relationship with a chatbot.
Yes.
You can have artificial relationships. Social media is not really a relationship.
Not at all.
And yet so many of our young people growing up, that is their social world, is their telephone, for instance, not real relationships with people. And so the implications of this are massive, and it's trying to get, and this is my biggest challenge, is in conversation with people, is trying to get them to think further upstream Because if we will go upstream, some of the things that are happening now don't make sense. We would change them.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't think upstream, we're just going to try harder and harder and harder with the interventions we have, which aren't working.
It's not working. On a personal level, what has this work taught you about yourself, about how you can learn, lead, or relate to others?
Number one, I've learned to listen more, to try and discover the grain of somebody's brain from them talking. So I would, whether it's watching a child or whether it's working with an educator or somebody in business, it's like having a pair of glasses on that you're looking for things that perhaps other people wouldn't be looking for. I'd be looking immediately to find out if someone were right or left dominant. What is their personality? And actually even ask about their children, because usually we have children who are different.
Mm-hmm.
It's very rare to get two very strong left brain children or two strong right brain children, for instance. And that often becomes an opportunity to have a conversation about some of these things, because everyone's interested in their children, for instance.
Yeah.
So I think I listen more. I'm very grateful. I think I can see more ways, more lenses by which to view people. And that helps me to try and build relationships on their terms and not just on my terms. And I think because I've been through a lot of, I've had a lot of trauma in my own life as well. It's helped me understand myself. It makes me a bit more aware, I suppose, of the traumas in other people's lives. We've all had trauma of different kinds, and some people have come through it and dealt with it. Some people it didn't get dealt with, and it's still a big barrier for them progressing. And so how do you have a conversation about that? So that would be quite important to me, about how you can help someone have a conversation about who they are, and not just who they want to project themselves to be. It's a big problem in our society in terms of trying to live out an image that you either want to project or you think people want you to have. And of course, that children get trained up that way in education as well too, sadly.
Absolutely, I agree. And this is very, very inspiring and very eye-opening. And we call these podcast conversations with the agents of change because we believe change happens when people question assumptions, redesign systems, and stay human while doing it. When you hear yourself described as an agent of change, how does that land on you?
I feel very privileged that God has given me the tools and the experience and the journey that at 76, I still want to be an agent of change. That has got stronger rather than diminished. And for whatever time God gives me in this earth, I would like to die as an agent of change and still be, as I said to someone there recently, I would like to be bursting across the finish line when my time comes and not just exhausted, like falling over.
Yes. And I really admire all your work. And this has been such a thoughtful conversation. I- What I take from this conversation is that being an agent of change isn't about fixing people. It's about redesigning systems that honor how people
Oh,
already are. And I just can thank you for your work. I absolutely adore your book. I read and read it again. And thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Agents of Change. And if this episode resonated, please share it with someone who's questioning how things are done and imagining how they could be done better. Until next time, keep going upstream. Thank you very much.
thank you so much, Izzy. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you.
Thank you so much. This podcast is produced by the Change Impact Group.